Ireland's foreign policy has undergone a remarkable transformation over the past century. From the early days of the Irish Free State, when external affairs were shaped by its complex ties with Britain, Ireland has steadily asserted its independence on the international stage. Its relationship with the UK, the United States, and later the European Union have defined its place in the world. Likewise, its active role in the United Nations and commitment to peacekeeping have built its reputation as a small state with a significant voice and principled position. Today, issues such as the war in Ukraine and debates over NATO membership pose new challenges, as do developments in the Middle East, where Ireland has been particularly vocal. To discuss all this, I'm delighted to be joined by Ben Tonra, Professor of International Relations at University College Dublin. So, hi, Ben. Thank you so much for joining us. Look, I'm aware that there's a lot that we will need to cover, but, I do usually like to start at the beginning when sort of talking about countries' foreign policies. And it does seem that Ireland had a really interesting emergence in the 1920s, obviously under very, very contentious circumstances of partition. But it gained this sort of status as a free state in 1922 and became a dominion alongside Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. But what did that really mean in terms of Ireland's ability to control its own external and security relations?
Yeah, I mean, you're right to say alongside Canada, Australia, etc. But you have to bear in mind that Ireland was very much an unwilling dominion. It had broken out of the United Kingdom and effectively under threat of war was forced to accept a status as a dominion within the then British Empire. So a lot of Irish diplomacy of that period throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s was really consumed with defining Ireland as an independent state, maximizing its room for latitude vis-a-vis the rest of the empire and soon to be Commonwealth, and really struggling to define itself and differentiate itself from the old colonial master. So, for example, you had a lot of diplomatic activity around, you might think the marginal things, but for a new state, very important thing, the right to fly the Irish flag on the high seas, the right of the Irish state to establish embassies overseas, the right of the Irish state not to have the king on their passports. And indeed, the one big salient was the right to register the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 as an international treaty. Because under British Commonwealth Empire tradition, that was, if you like, a family agreement. It wasn't international. So the Irish state expended huge diplomatic energy simply to register that treaty with the League of Nations. The other thing I'd point to in that period, too, is the Irish commitment to collective security. Because there was a real sense, a small country has to rely on international law, international institutions. And so the country was very deeply committed to the League of Nations and worked very hard to establish itself both as a member of the League and also as a supporter of the League. So when you look, for example, at some of the major League challenges in the 1930s, the Italian invasion of Abyssinia and the civil war in Spain, the Irish state put itself very firmly on the side of the League in the teeth of a lot of domestic political opposition, particularly coming from the Catholic Church, because League of Nations sanctions against Italy were something the Vatican wasn't keen on, and the Irish state's support for the Republic in Spain was also something the Vatican wasn't keen on. So the Irish state worked very, very hard to establish its bona fides as a good international citizen, one committed to multilateral institutions and international law.
So I guess that obviously then brings us to the next big stepping stone, which of course was the Second World War. Ireland, I think we could probably admit, very controversially took the decision to take a neutral position in that. What was the thinking behind that, and how did that relate to what went before, and in many ways what's come after?
Well, we think of it as being controversial in retrospect, but at the time there were lots of European neutrals. They simply didn't survive the Second World War. Irish neutrality survived the Second World War, which gives it a much different complexion than, for example, Belgium and Norway. The other thing to bear in mind about Irish neutrality was it very much has to be framed in the context of the failure of the League of Nations. It was the failure of the League of Nations that forced the Irish state to reconsider its options. And its options were very, very few. It had no defense capacity of its own. The British Admiralty had already clearly decided they couldn't defend the Irish state themselves, which is why they withdrew from the so-called treaty ports in 1937, 1938. And Ireland was within less than a generation of a very, very bitter civil war over the terms of the treaty with the UK and in terms of partition. So for Ireland to have committed itself to not the Allied cause, but effectively the British cause in 1938-39 would have potentially torn the country apart. So I think neutrality, in very hard, cold, neo-realist terms, neutrality was really the only option available to the Irish state. Now, the nature of that neutrality was very particular. As the then Prime Minister said to the German ambassador, it was inevitable that there would have to be a certain consideration to the Allies. And there has been a library written about the way in which Irish neutrality bent itself into knots to assist the Allied cause and not to expose the British state from the rear. And of course, if you look at Swedish neutrality, you look at Swiss neutrality, every neutral bent the rules of neutrality to suit his geostrategic position, just as the Irish state did. So, for example, if Allied air personnel, landed in Ireland, they were spirited back across the border to rejoin the RAF, whereas their German and Italian counterparts were interned. Irish weather reports were broadcast in the clear, which was only of aid and assistance to the Allied cause. And as you'll be aware, very famously, the entire D-Day landings were predicated on a weather report from close to my home place in County Mayo in Belmullet. So there was a very particular nature to that Irish neutrality. But as you say, at the end of the war, there was a lot of hostility towards Ireland, a lot of hostility in terms of, for example, the Soviet Union vetoing Ireland's membership of the United Nations based on the fact that the Soviets judged Ireland not to be a peace-loving nation. And a lot of animosity and understandable animosity from the United Kingdom towards Ireland in that post-war period. And that neutrality and the expression of that neutrality also gave a very blinkered perspective to Irish foreign policy. I mean, Irish foreign policy in the post-war period was all directed towards fighting what they saw as the iniquities of partition. That was on nobody's list of things to do in the post-war world, but it was something that Irish foreign policy was absolutely consumed with. So there was a desperate parochialism to Irish foreign policy throughout the 1940s and well into the mid-1950s until our UN membership rose on the horizon.
No, I think you sort of touched on that sort of Cold War element and Ireland's decision to not join NATO. Was there any debate at the time on NATO membership? And I'm guessing that relationship with the UK was fundamental to that debate. It would be interesting to hear a little bit about what the perspective from Ireland was on the Cold War and on the prospects of NATO membership.
Well, you have to remember that Ireland was a deeply, deeply conservative country in the late 1940s. I mean, to the extent that if you remember even of the Irish Labour Party, a very, very moderate social democratic party, come election time, there'd be allegations of communism and Reds under the beds. So Ireland was a deeply conservative and Western in orientation country in the late 1940s. I had the great privilege of interviewing the foreign minister of the time, Sean McBride, later to become a Lenin Peace Prize winner, which gives you a sense of his politics. He was then foreign minister in the late 1940s as part of an inter-party government. And in interviewing him, he was very, very clear, because for him, membership of NATO was ideologically unacceptable, and he didn't like the idea of the West versus East, and he wanted Ireland to plow an independent path. But he also knew that argument was unsellable within a very conservative cabinet. So he was very artful and very clever, and he predicated his approach to NATO precisely in terms of Ireland's relationship with the United Kingdom and the fact of partition on the island of Ireland. So he told his cabinet colleagues, listen, if we join NATO, we are guaranteeing the borders of all NATO members. If we guarantee the borders of all NATO members, we are guaranteeing the border on this island, which none of us agree with. So therefore, membership of NATO is impossible unless we get assurances that, for example, the United States will assist us in browbeating the British into eliminating that border. Now, clearly, in the geostrategic position of the time, that was fantasy, and also, again, as I say, speaks to the parochialism of Irish foreign policy at the time. But just to underscore the fact, when Ireland refused the invitation to attend the conference in Washington in 1949, that was immediately followed up by a trip by the Irish foreign minister to the United States to secure a bilateral defense pact with the United States. Now, he got no serious meetings. His entities, fell on deaf ears. But again, it just illustrates the fact that Ireland was ideologically and morally absolutely fixed to the West, but had this very unique issue with the United Kingdom with respect to partition, which made NATO membership impossible. So that when you look at UN membership, Ireland was very much seen in everybody's eyes as an integral part of the West. And Ireland presented its membership to the United Nations as being founded on three pillars: non-adherence to bloc politics, a commitment to the UN Charter, but thirdly, a commitment to Western civilization. Now, as you know, there's a contradiction there between the first principle and the third principle. And that really does underscore Irish foreign policy in that early Cold War period. Ireland was an intrinsic part of the West, and yet at the same time not a part of the West's defense alliance.
One area that Ireland has made an absolutely enormous contribution over the decades has been in peacekeeping. And, there were some very, very difficult missions. I think particularly, for example, the mission in Congo, where Ireland was actually caught up, Irish troops were caught up in fighting and defending a position. How much did that then become the focus of Irish foreign policy and that multilateralism? At the same time, did it have any relationship with the non-aligned movement and that bloc within the UN?
Most definitely. I mean, and I think again, just to refer back, I think this is a thread that you can follow through Irish foreign policy. That commitment to multilateral institutions, that commitment to international law, and that commitment to collective security. When membership of the UN was first mooted in the late 1940s, although it was vetoed 3 times by the Soviet Union, there are fascinating debates in Parliament where the then Taoiseach Eamon de Valera, who led and sort of thought through the implications of Irish neutrality in the Second World War, was very clearly saying, membership of the UN is the end of neutrality. Chapter 7 of the UN Charter implies collective security. You cannot be neutral and be part of this thing called the United Nations. So that decision was already there in the late 1940s. Now, of course, the UN that we eventually joined in the late 1950s, Chapter 7 no longer applied because of Cold War pressures. But that was part of the thinking that we went in, that the UN was a collective security organization and Ireland needed to make its contribution there too. So Ireland was almost immediately invited to participate in the Congo operation. It was something the Irish government went into with its eyes only half open. There's some fascinating historical documents about the level of unpreparedness of the Irish military going into Congo. A desperate naivete in terms of how they would be received and understood, thinking of themselves as post-colonial, thinking of themselves as victims of British imperialism, and yet on the ground in Congo being indistinguishable from the former Belgian white colonialists. So that juxtaposition, that tension between who the Irish thought they were and how the Irish were received and seen to be is very, very striking. But then you see, as you say yourself, that commitment has been ongoing and consistent. Since the mid 1950s, there have always been Irish troops serving in UN peacekeeping. Not a day has passed from the mid 1950s when there hasn't been Irish troops wearing the UN blue hat. Now that has entailed some changes and evolution over time. Originally, our contribution to the UN were limited to operations of a peacekeeping character. With Somalia in the early 1990s, we changed our legislation to allow more robust engagement, and we're now actually in the midst of a very bitter and fraught political debate about eliminating the requirement for UN authorization for the overseas deployment of Irish troops. Again, reflecting the geopolitical realities of the UN Security Council therein, but also underlining and underscoring, I think, the commitment of the Irish state precisely to collective security and international peacekeeping at a global level.
I have to say, I'm really, this is absolutely fascinating. And the 1970s, I think, was a really defining period in several different ways for Ireland. I think, firstly, there was the eruption of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, a return to violence in Northern Ireland, and all that that entailed for the bilateral relationship with the United Kingdom. But of course, it was also a period when Ireland, along with the United Kingdom, joined the European Union. And so that opened up a very different vista. It would be sort of interesting to hear a little bit about how those two factors interplayed with each other over the course of the 1970s and 1980s.
Well, certainly in the late 1960s, early 1970s, with the outbreak of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland and the repressive response from the government in Northern Ireland and then from the British state, it really created a desperate tension and threatened security and stability on the island of Ireland. We had very bitter political conflicts and civil conflicts in the Republic over what was going on in Northern Ireland. Um, you also had a situation in which the British government, for many years, refused to allow or refused to countenance any contribution of the Irish state to a resolution of the conflict in Northern Ireland. The British insisted this was an internal matter for them, required no international intervention, and that the British state was more than capable of dealing with issues within the British state. Um, and so it's been a struggle for Irish diplomacy and a major focus of Irish diplomacy throughout the 1970s and into the mid 1980s, simply to get a seat at the table at which a resolution of the conflict of Northern Ireland would be accomplished. And that delay caused the deaths of nearly 3,500 people on the island of Ireland and in our neighbouring island. So that was an ongoing effort. But as you say, membership of the European Union was a game changer for us because it gave us a seat at the table on precisely an equal level with the United Kingdom. It meant that Irish ministers, Irish officials, Irish diplomats were shoulder to shoulder with their British colleagues, developed many affinities, had many commonalities, many shared perspectives, as well as some quite substantial differences on the common agricultural policy. But nonetheless, working together on a regular basis, and that warmed up, there's no doubt, the bilateral relationship, and allowed for conversations at the margin of EU Council meetings, at the margin of ministerial meetings, even at the level of working groups, and created personal bonds that allowed and facilitated some of the progress that we saw then in the late 80s and early 1990s. So they're two parts, two very different sides of the same equation, balancing a very difficult bilateral relationship over time, but creating a certain level of equality of treatment and of respect between both sides, which contributed in the end to the kind of partial resolution that we have at the moment.
Yes, and I think that, that obviously is if we like, the next staging point, which of course was the Good Friday Agreement. And what that really did for Irish sort of foreign and security policy. I mean, it would seem to have revolutionized the relationship with the United Kingdom in so many different ways. But also, what sort of changes did we see in Irish foreign policy at the turn of the millennium as a result of this? Was there a sort of a different outreach, if you like, because I guess so much time and energy had been put into dealing with the situation with the North. Did Ireland find itself freed up now to be sort of considering different issues and different approaches to international affairs?
You'd like to think so, but I have to say I'd be a bit of a cynic and a skeptic on that point. I mean, you're right to say a huge amount of resources and attention had gone into the bilateral relationship. What was then called the Anglo-Irish division, attracted the best and the best and the brightest in terms of Irish diplomacy and Irish efforts. So with the Good Friday Agreement, that's still a priority. Relationships within Northern Ireland, relationships north-south, relationships east-west is still a cardinal point within Irish foreign policy. But I have to say, I don't think that there was a real recalibration of Irish foreign policy towards the rest of the world as a result. I think really it was a case of, thank God that is at least on the track towards resolution. Let's keep it on track. Let's keep motoring along. But I think in a sense also a sigh of relief that some of the issues that the Department of Foreign Affairs was dealing with were no longer quite so existential as they had been. I would say a little bit more effort going into the European Union and developing partnerships, but nothing along the level that I would have liked to have seen, certainly in the mid to late 1990s and into the early 2000s.
And of course, we saw Ireland sort of this radical transformation in terms of society, in terms of economics. It's now, well, per capita is one of the wealthiest countries on the planet. It's managed to attract a lot of foreign investment. But I'd like to look a little bit at the relationship with the United States, because obviously so much of this is about tech investment. And you'd sort of touched a little bit about that crucial relationship in the 1940s and doing that mutual defense agreement. And we think of Ireland's relationship. I mean, people in Britain often talk of a special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States, but of course, there is also a special relationship between Ireland and the United States, and it has shaped so much of, I guess, Ireland's outlook. So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit about that.
I think in a sense that can be overplayed, and certainly Irish diplomats would be the first to try and overplay it. Um, but again, because of the nature of the relationship, which is very particular, based in demographics, based in immigration, based in a lot of culture, a lot of shared history, um, we have seen the growth of Irish America as a political force, first mostly within the Democratic Party, and then more lately within the Republican Party. And Irish diplomats put a huge amount of energy in developing that, not least because certainly in the 1970s and into the 1980s, there was a very substantial portion of Irish American opinion which was very supportive of Sinn Féin IRA, which directly funded aspects of the terror campaign that we experienced in the 70s and 80s, or the civil rights movement, or indeed, as others would see, the rightful use of arms. But that money flowing in, that political support, was very dangerous to the Irish state. So a lot of effort going into redefining that relationship, educating Irish America as to the realities on the ground, but also then trying to leverage American politicians into helping us deal with the issue of Northern Ireland. That resulted in no aid and assistance until the end of the Cold War, until Bill Clinton. That opened up vistas, opened up opportunities, which were then exploited with full effect, bringing in Bill Clinton, bringing in a U.S. diplomacy to help resolve the situation in Northern Ireland, and came at a crucial stage, which facilitated precisely that transformation. I would say, though, in sort of as a coda to that, in speaking to Irish diplomats, and asking them about this, our own special relationship, what they will always say is, listen, the Irish American angle will get you in the door. It will get someone to lift the phone. It will get you into a meeting. But after that, you're on your own. After that, it's the strength of the argument. It's your ability to convince. It's not a magic wand. And I think even British counterparts who, were at the cold end of Irish America would acknowledge that while Irish diplomacy was very successful, it was based on a lot of damn hard work, not simply a lot of shillelaghs and shamrock.
I guess sort of moving on to a more contemporary outlook, the first question I'd really like to ask is about Brexit. I think one of the things which I felt very strongly, like many other people in the UK, was the damage that this did to the relationship with Ireland. That you'd mentioned the fact that there had been that sense of equality that had emerged, that Ireland and Britain sat together as equals within the European Union, and then suddenly found themselves in a much more confrontational position of having to open up a lot of old wounds over Northern Ireland. How did Ireland approach that? And not just in terms of the bilateral relationship with the UK and trying to negotiate, because of course, Ireland was one of three countries that UK had to negotiate at a bilateral basis, as well as with the European Union as a whole. So it was Ireland, it was obviously Spain over Gibraltar, and Cyprus over the British bases. But it wasn't just that bilateral relationship with the UK. It was also about Ireland bringing on board its European partners. How did Ireland approach this issue of Brexit?
Well, the first thing to bear in mind is that Brexit was existential. Brexit was an existential threat to peace and security on the island of Ireland, and there's no getting around that from the get-go. And to be fair, we did have Tony Blair, we did have John Major, making that argument. What Ireland saw from the British establishment of the time, however, was an absolute criminal irresponsibility in not thinking through the implications of Brexit for the island of Ireland and what that would result in. And I say criminal responsibility with absolute solemnity and absolute determination. There was a criminal disregard for those implications, in terms of creating a new border, recreating a hard border, recreating tensions on the island of Ireland, and very much the threat of violence arising therefrom. I think in Ireland there was a hope and expectation that our European partners would assist us. But I think Ireland was absolutely bowled over by the level of solidarity, the absolute commitment of our 26 partners to row in behind. So, in fact, there were little, if no, bilateral talks with the UK on Brexit. It was all done through Brussels. And it was all done through Brussels, through Michel Barnier, through national capitals, a hell of a lot of Irish diplomacy going into those national capitals to make all of our partners aware of how serious, how existential, what a security issue this was for us. And so therefore the solidarity that we received, and I'll just give you a sort of an aphorism I gave to a group that I was speaking to the other day. You know, Ireland's foreign policy maturity had reached the stage that we could watch the ancient enemy beaten into submission by our gallant allies in Europe. And that really is how Brexit is seen from Dublin. That is what we witnessed. We saw the British state torn asunder by its running through hoops and trying to contradict itself and in dealing with the realities of Brexit when they hadn't thought them through, and being brought face to face with those realities and being forced to deal with those realities. And it took a long time. I mean, it was 2016 to when was the Windsor Framework 2023. I mean, we're still working through some of those implications today. But it was, I say, a testament to Irish diplomacy through the European Union. It was a huge testament to our European allies, and it was to the eternal condemnation of the British political establishment that they didn't think of this in advance and deal with it in advance.
Yeah, I remember very, very clearly at the time of the Brexit referendum. It was very interesting how little Northern Ireland was discussed in that referendum campaign, and I would actually agree it was criminal. But I think, Ben, if we could sort of just look at, I've got a couple more questions, and thanks so much for all your time so far, that I'd sort of like to look at. The first is, of course, well, there's three more questions, I guess. The first is Ukraine and Russia's invasion and how that was responded to in Ireland. Because, of course, one of the major things that we saw was that Finland and Sweden, two EU members that had been neutral, gave up that neutrality to join NATO. And that means that there are just 4 EU members now that are still neutral. You have Cyprus, you have Malta, you have Austria, and you have Ireland. And I know that there's been sort of a degree of discussion about how Ireland should respond to that, to the war in Ukraine, what neutrality means, but what does that also mean for joining NATO? Given, of course, that Ireland is also incredibly important for European transatlantic links, and this has an important security dimension.
I think what we've seen, I mean, there's always been a sense, Ireland for 800 years, Ireland suffered by virtue of its geostrategic position. For the last 80 years, Ireland has been a beneficiary of its geostrategic position, and that benign geostrategic position has led to a real absence of serious thought and consideration and commitment to the very ideas of security and defense. Never mind alliances. So the state of our defense forces has been abysmal. The state of national conversation on security defense has been non-existent, to the extent that, to give you one sort of graphic illustration, we have no system of national security clearance in this country. None. So it gives you a sense of the low base from which we're starting all of these conversations. Because we didn't have to think about defense, we didn't think about defense. Russia's invasion of Ukraine shifted the conversation, at least in the direction of now taking security defense seriously. We're still insulated by our geography. We are still insular in terms of our psychology. But what I would say is, and the Irish government has been very clear on this, and I think you see that also at the level of civil society, Ireland is in no way neutral in respect of Ukraine. Ireland is absolutely committed to Ukraine, Ukraine's defense, Ukraine's membership of the European Union on an accelerated basis, and absolute and complete condemnation of Russia and support for sanctions against Russia. Where the line has been drawn is on the support for lethal munitions going to Ukraine. First point, of course, is Ireland has no lethal munitions which would be of any earthly use to Ukraine other than literally about 10 to 11 Javelin missiles. So there's no capacity there to assist. But there is a residual, I would say, confusion in the Irish public mind between neutrality and pacifism. And I think that does play out, for example, in Ireland's support for aid through the European Peace Fund to Ukraine, but Ireland's refusal to fund the lethal aspects of that. So we have taken far and away more refugees than many other countries in Europe from Ukraine. We have contributed economic aid, we have contributed military aid short of that lethal component. There is an ongoing conversation, however, on that broader security defense front, particularly in the sense of not only Ireland needing to defend itself. We had a cyber attack against our health service, which led to deaths. We have had Russian incursions in our airspace. We've had Russian incursions in our maritime space. So there is an agenda here now in terms of increased investment in defense and security to address threats to our state, but also a sense that we need to plug in the gaps, whereas we're a backdoor or we're a weak link in broader European security defense. And a lot of time and attention and money, indeed, is being spent on that. To be frank with you, there is no debate on NATO membership. There is no political party that advocates it. There's no leading political figure that advocates it. In fact, the parties more often than not compete in terms of their dedication to the principle of neutrality, because in an Irish context, and I think this is really important, neutrality in an Irish context has never been about not taking sides. Neutrality in an Irish context has always been about being the good international citizen, being anti-nuclear weapons, pro-development, pro-human rights, pro-justice, in favor of the little guy, and anti-imperial. That is what people here understand neutrality to be. I don't think there's a connection between neutrality and any of those values. You probably don't think there's a connection between neutrality and any of those values, because at essence, neutrality precisely means not taking sides rather than taking the right side. But nonetheless, that's the status of the debate here. And so there is no national debate in respect of joining NATO, not least because our geostrategic situation does not necessitate it in the way that it did for both Finland and Sweden.
I hope you're finding this helpful. If so, please consider giving the video a like and perhaps subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, or maybe share it with somebody else who might be interested. It all really helps. Many thanks. And now back to the interview. You mentioned all these sort of values that Ireland sort of and the people in Ireland sort of see the country as upholding. And there is, of course, one area where Ireland has become particularly outspoken, especially in the past couple of years, which is, of course, the Middle East. And it would be interesting to hear a little bit more about why Ireland has felt so strongly about the events that we've been seeing in Gaza, why it's taken the position it has done on Israel-Palestine.
I think it's the depth of historical resonance. It's also contemporary sort of political matchmaking, and its principle. In terms of historical resonance, I think, the idea of an implanted people on another territory, pushing out the quote unquote native occupants of that territory, has the most obvious resonance in an Irish historical context, which can't be abridged and have to be understood. Now, interestingly, in the early days of the Israeli state, there were actually a lot of synergies between the old Israeli Irgun and the then contemporary IRA. So there's a counter narrative, a counter history there that nobody speaks about anymore, but it does exist. So those historical resonances are important. The contemporary political leverage, I think, is also important insofar as the unionist, loyalist population in Northern Ireland very closely identifies with the state of Israel. Irish nationalists and Irish Republicans very closely identify with the PLO before and with Palestinian resistance today. So you will go to Northern Ireland, neighborhoods in Northern Ireland, and where you see Union Jacks, you will see Stars of David flying. And where you see Irish tricolors flying in Northern Ireland, you will see the Palestinian flag flying. So there's a contemporary historical political fusion of identities with respect to that conflict. But the third, I think, is actually more important, and that is the principle. And what we have seen the Israeli state undertake over not just since October 7th, but in terms of the structure of the Israeli state, its treatment of the Palestinians, its consistent since the Oslo Accords undermining of a two-state solution, and now these most recent manifestations simply give voice to long-standing Irish criticisms of human rights abuses, of the absolute necessity of a two-state solution, and opposition to the Israeli government's efforts to undermine that as a prospect, which is why I think you've seen Irish governments lead on these issues. Now, interestingly, for your audience, there's an interesting tension that's appearing at the moment. We have legislation before our parliaments called the Occupied Territories Bill, which would make illegal trade in goods and services with elements in occupied territories in Israel-Palestine. That has raised furore on the American right in the United States. We've had U.S. senators, U.S. congresspeople say that Ireland will be the object of U.S. ire and retribution if we dare pass the Occupied Territories Bill. It will put U.S. multinationals in Ireland in a very invidious position in terms of their Israeli subsidiaries, some of their Israeli sites. So there are some interesting chickens coming home to roost in terms of a clash of interests in terms of Ireland's relationship with the US and Ireland's determination to support a two-state solution in Israel-Palestine.
And Ben, I think, and that brings me really nicely to the final question, which is, of course, that relationship with the United States, especially under the Trump administration. And you've already touched on some of that. I mean, how has Ireland been navigating this? Now, obviously, so much of this is being done through the European Union, especially on those trade and on those tariff issues that have been central to Trump's policy. But how has Ireland sort of negotiated its traditional friendship with the United States? And you've sort of mentioned that element about how the Middle East has come into it. But what in other ways have you seen in Ireland since the emergence of the second Trump administration?
Thus far, I'd have to say it's been very nimble, been very agile, and it's been a case of keeping our head down. I think a lot of the heavy lifting we expect the European Union to do on the big ticket items of trade and regulation. We have very particular interest therein in respect of pharma. A lot of Irish diplomatic activity, has been underway in Washington, trying to acquaint U.S. policymakers with some of those realities and the implications for Ireland coming out of that in terms of our foreign direct investment. We've had our Taoiseach has had that experience of sitting in the Oval Office and facing the incoherent stream of consciousness coming from President Trump with no adverse consequences. If you go back and look at the tape, you can see the muscles twitching in Micheál Martin's face, but he doesn't challenge, he doesn't contradict. He simply sits there and lets it flow over him, and then comes back to the points that he wanted to make during the conversation. So I think it's been adroit to date. It's been a case of keeping our head down and pushing those buttons that are available to us. But as of yet, we haven't come to a hard crunch. I think potentially over the Occupied Territories Bill, we have a potential hard crunch, because that puts into contradistinction, very, very strong and well-established principles of Irish foreign policy against very powerful interests in Irish foreign policy. And it will be curious to see how the Irish government attempts to square that circle in terms of the final shape of this legislation, the passage of this legislation, and the execution of that legislation, particularly as it pertains to Irish multinationals. The only other point I'd make in that respect is the fact that because of the number of multinationals we have in terms of foreign direct investment, what we very often find is that it is Irish regulators who are responsible for implementing EU law in respect of Microsoft and Google, whether it's competition or whether it's data regulation or whether it's privacy. And there have been quite a few complaints from other European regulators that the Irish sort of softly approach to some of these big US multinationals is not tenable in the immediate to near term. And we've already seen Donald Trump, giving voice to his frustration with EU legislation, EU taxation policy. The moment at which Donald Trump realizes that some of these fines are being proposed by Irish regulators as part of their European responsibilities, it will be interesting again to see, whether the Irish nut gets cracked between those two rocks.
Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. I mean, that was absolutely fantastic, and it's such a wide-ranging review. And I really appreciated there was a lot there to try and cover, and I think that you did it absolutely brilliantly. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure, James, and thanks for the invitation, man.
I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos on foreign policy that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.